Faith can feel like hearts and butterflies until someone lights a match and burns it all to the ground. Welcome to the Burning Butterflies podcast.
The sad thing is that there's abuse of every kind within the church. But the spiritual abuse is the stuff that just
It's a place there shouldn't be abuse. Like, there just shouldn't be abuse in a place that claims Jesus.
Well, it ruins your soul. If you're new here, we suggest listening to our prologue episode first. This is the story of two women's journey through spiritual abuse and escaping from toxic church culture while finding hope in Christ.
Sometimes it's just the facts, and if you get offended by it, that's a you issue. And if we can't be mature enough to have these conversations, even if some of the topics are difficult, then shame on us. So, here's a term that we're going to talk about today called pulpit shaming. And I do realize that we might have a listener here or there who's never heard that term, and you will be fully aware of what it is when we get done with this episode. But I was a person who had never heard the term pulpit shaming. I know at some point you were a person who had never heard the term pulpit shaming. And it's very interesting to me because when we decided we were going to do a specific episode on this topic, I started to think back of like, when did I realize or become exposed to this thing that is called pulpit shaming? And I've read a lot of sermons and a lot of pastors talk, and I will honestly say that my understanding was only in this one specific church. That doesn't mean that doesn't happen other places. I mean, it happens. But I've realized one of two things. You either have to be in the know to know who the pastor's talking about and know behind the scenes details to realize that there's pulpit shaming going on. That's probably like the key component. Because I feel like it's not that I've probably never heard a pastor pulpit shame before, come as you are, but I wasn't.
You weren't close enough.
Close enough to any details to know that this mysterious person in this example person in this story was a specific person. But also the other thing to that is I can't think of a time when, and maybe it's probably more my awareness because it probably happens. It's probably happened in churches that I've been to more than I know, that the story specifically used to shame or to clean up, to give a specific narrative and used to keep other church members in line.
Or we might not use a story about a specific person, but we'll take the entire theme of the sermon. The Bible verses used are to drive home a point, and that point is all for one person sitting in the pews. That point is to be driven home to them. To shame them. Right.
And to, as a symptom of that, also keep other people from following the same behavior.
Yep.
And that, my friends, is a cult tactic.
Yes. 100%. Well, and then you add on, so this is all coming from, we have this list of things that are, they're characteristics that high control organizations use. And so these are the characteristics that you and I sat in a hotel room at a podcasting conference and we went through these.
Minds
and we were like,
blown.
We were in a cult.
Identification and example. So those who behave correctly or incorrectly are used as examples. Suggested behaviors can be inferred from their stories without direct command. Stories can be reframed or blatantly untrue. And you add in there this purpose of shaming and Oh my goodness gracious. It just goes on and on. Yeah.
So you have that, and you add on top of that the
Yep.
reversal.
That's exactly
which
what I
is
was
where the leadership or the group doctrine are above reproach. So any
failed promises.
anything that they promise you that they can't fulfill, or any bad situations, are always the fault of someone else.
Yeah. Never the leadership and never the organization.
Yes.
Yeah, and so you just put those two things together where stories are being reframed from a public stage. Like this is, you are being told, whether you're subconscious or consciously being told, this is how you behave. This person was wrong, and so
From
then
someone who is a spiritual authority.
authority,
over you.
and you're like, oh, I can't behave. Like you learn really quick, like how you can and cannot behave. So for me personally, my first recollection, like if I went through the whole process of, I came to church and I was attending to church, and I'm starting to serve, and I'm starting to like get involved, and there's a moment of like, there's those moments where you hear of the examples, and I think up until Come As You Are, this is where I was at. You hear stories that the pastors use in their sermons, and you're like, yeah, I can see that happening. That's very realistic. Maybe I've experienced something like that. Maybe I have. That's a very good analogy. Like, there's a reason why we have analogies and metaphor, because they relate to, most people can relate to them. And so you're in that very, it's just a generalization. People experience these things. Okay. Then as you move along and you get more involved and you start to know people, then there might be a moment of like awareness of where you're like, oh, so and so
speak to that person.
Yeah, so and so went through that, right? Or
have you ever listened to a sermon and felt like, ooh, this would be a great message for this person because of what they're going through in their life?
Yeah. So that happens, right?
Yeah.
And then I remember there being a moment of where I knew the story and I heard it said from stage. And I was like, oh, like he's talking about these people.
Yeah. And
specifically.
He's not using names.
Yeah.
Like Tom would never use names.
No, there's no
He
names.
would say,
I just happen to know.
There's this one time, or my favorite way of him doing this would be like, I called it his shotgun technique. He would shotgun and just kind of wide pepper spread this buckshot of a list of sins or a list of struggles. But he would start that shotgun and end that shotgun list with what was actually the problem.
Right.
That he was trying to address.
Yeah. And so I realized that at some point, like, I now started to know enough people and know enough things that I was now aware of these things being used. Like, but I didn't have an awareness that it was a problem, right? And I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
So then the other way that the next thing that I became aware of was that when people would leave the church, the narrative would be told from stage. So like you started to know, and I said, the more you got into the inner circle, the more you knew what was being talked about on stage. The other one was shaming the worship team in a sermon, where somebody on the worship team would do something and it would be used as a teaching point. Like, look at how this happened and look at how we got past it. That was not to be helpful.
No.
Or to use that worship leader as an example. That was definitely every other worship leader knew. Don't mess up the words.
Yeah.
Don't sing the wrong. You don't sing the wrong word. Don't say the wrong thing. Act a certain way. It was used to keep the worship team in line.
Yeah. That's my favorite one, is when because he did it multiple times and he's still doing it. He is still doing it.
Yeah.
Because I have no shame. I listen to their stuff because there's sometimes I want to know what they're saying. I'm curious. Have we learned our lesson? Have we moved on?
Right.
Tom is still standing on stage, and just a few weeks ago he says, who noticed that the worship team sang the wrong word?
Yeah.
Who noticed? You wouldn't have noticed if we didn't have a volunteer up in the sound booth putting the words up there. Pulpit shame number 1.
Yeah.
We need volunteers.
Yeah.
You are benefiting from the fact that someone is volunteering their time to sit up there and click through the slides to give you the words on the screen.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So then he goes on of, you wouldn't have known that they messed up the words if we hadn't put them up there. But guess what? That makes us stronger as a worship team. And he goes on for 6 minutes.
Yeah.
6 minutes.
And let me tell you how that worship leader felt. Like garbage.
Yeah.
Like
the
absolute
whole time.
garbage. Because you just called out something nobody noticed.
Yeah.
But that's pulpit shaming. And then, so this goes on.
Yeah.
Right? And so I was at the church for 10 years. I was at the church for 10 years. And this was going on from the moment I walked in the door until the moment I walked out the door. And it wasn't until a few months before I left the church that you, Brandy, and I were having a conversation and you said the words pulpit shaming. And I was like, what? And you're like, yeah, you know. And I'm like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. And I could think of every single instance of like, I knew that was about that. Oh my goodness, he was pulpit shaming them. He was pulpit shaming. Like, has he ever pulpit shamed me up? Yeah. As a worship leader, there's been things, but you know, I was gladly martyred and used as an example because yes, I make mistakes too. We're not perfect up on this stage. We have to be humble, you know, and it's okay that we make mistakes. And so, yeah, like it all just like puzzle piece clicked. But what's even more funny to me is that since we timelined our trauma for this podcast, it wasn't until literally a week or two ago when I was talking about the first sermon that I listened to and how I was so impressed that he was talking about drugs and alcohol. But it wasn't until we timelined this entire journey that we realized the person he was pulpit shaming, and he was really actually giving a narrative to a situation that had happened because he wanted the church to have a specific narrative, was all about his son. Froggy.
And that's where you've kind of coined the term pulpit mopping.
Yeah, because I was
so you have
he wasn't shaming him, he was cleaning up his mess.
Yeah.
Because so everybody knew.
Yeah, we're going to change the narrative.
Yeah.
And we want to give...
Because the pastor's son went off again and was being his bad self. And so now we have to give the narrative to the church. And then as a parent, which was not said, like there's nothing in his sermon that indicated to me that he was going through this with his child. Absolutely nothing.
No, because he's not going to stand up there and say,
no,
Froggy did this.
Because he was talking to other people. If you have a child, if you are in this situation, that's how that sermon was. And because I remember, it was like,
because you felt like he was talking to you.
I do. I know these situations, right? No,
like
he was giving the church a narrative on how to approach his son who's out there doing bad things.
Yep.
Pulpit mopping.
Which I didn't know that term until probably just a few months before I said it to you.
That's crazy.
Because, and it was, so eventually we will get to the point of the timeline where Amanda is put in the sound booth.
Yeah.
Because we just don't know what to do with her.
What are we going to do with Amanda?
So
just put her in the sound booth.
We're going to put her up in the dark corner where no one can see her.
She can control all the things she wants to control.
And she's not allowed to talk to anyone. And no one can come up and talk to her because she's too busy.
That's a good place for her.
So we're just going to put Amanda up in this sound booth. And so through that process, there was also another gentleman who he was kind of a problem because he had come from a very healthy
megachurch
church.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, did this church have its problems? Yeah, but I mean, like, I'm coming to the point where I'm like, every church has its problems. It's just about like how you deal with them in a healthy way.
Yeah.
That makes you a healthy church.
Right.
So he came from a very healthy church.
Right.
So he started getting involved. And so he's like, oh, well, like, have we thought about doing things this way? When you're dealing with a narcissistic leader, you don't come in and suggest that the way they've done things for 20 years is quite possibly outdated or wrong. And so this guy gets put up in the sound booth with me, because what are we going to do with two people who feel like they know what to do? Like, we're just going to put them up in
throw them up in the sound booth. We'll see how let them sort it all out.
Yep. So we're up there, and we are to the point where neither one of us are at a place where we really want to listen to what
is being said
from stage. Yeah. And so we're just I'm up there just paying enough attention that I can click through the slides when I need to put them up on the screen. And he's once a speaker starts, you kind of set the audio, and then you can kind of just zone out. I mean, unless like crap hits the fan or something.
Right. And just to put this in perspective, like, we will get there, but this is towards the end of our time at the church. Like, just this is right before the exit. So just to give a time frame, if you understand why there's like, I'm done listening, I'm working on my exit strategy. So yes, like, I'm going to sit here and click a button.
2020 after COVID is what the timeline that we're talking about. But anyway, him and I get to having whisper conversations up in the, because it's a Thursday night and there's a whole like 4 people in the audience, and they're all in the front row. Yeah. So
nobody can hear you.
No one can hear us having whisper conversations in the dark corner of the back of the
the church dungeon. Yeah.
And so
I was a sound person for a long time. I can call it a church dungeon.
We are having these conversations, and he brings up the fact that Tom pulpit shames. Yeah. And I said, like, what do you mean? Yeah. Because I had never heard that before. And he goes, oh, like where he doesn't stand up and say, oh, Amanda did this wrong, and this is how you don't. He's like, but I've watched him pulpit shame you for the last 2 years. Yeah. And I was like, oh, because I realized there's a name to what I had been experiencing, and people who knew me and knew what I was going through. Yeah.
No, like, I'm one of those people.
They could put 2 and 2 together and be like, oh, he's talking about Amanda.
If you were in any Bible studies with Tom, if you were in any classes, if you spent any time at the church, you would begin to know what was going on in people's lives. He was like, no, I knew that was you he was talking about. He wasn't the only one. Yeah. I knew, like.
Yeah. But I had sat, I mean, honestly, like, I'm sure when I was in youth, I never sat in a service. Right. I went years without sitting in a Sunday service. I was supposed to get the cassette tape, and then later on the CD. I was supposed to get those, like, because they
and go listen to them.
And go listen to them. And, like, I'm going to be honest, I never did.
Yeah. That's okay.
I said I did.
You cheated on your salvation test and you lied about listening to the sermons? How can we be friends? No, actually, that's why I love you. Go for it.
So, I never went and listened, but I'm sure he was pulpit shaming me back then, because that's, I mean, like, as you've heard from the stories I've told so far, there's things that I did that rubbed Tom the wrong way. Right. And so.
And when you're a person who's looking to be approved of, and you want to do what's right, which we've all said that. I know we're not the only people, but this is how you control your church. Yeah. You use the examples that you use to shame people into behaving a certain way, so you only have to deal with it once.
Yeah. And the biggest, like, the most impactful one to me was, there is a point in time that Brandy and I were told not only were we not allowed to serve in ministry together, we were not allowed to be friends anymore. Like, could not be friends, could not hang out, could not be in the same room together. We were not allowed to, like, be seen talking to each other. And I mean, Brandy and I were close, like super, super close. And we had to, like, come over to each other's houses, like, in secret. Yeah. So no one would know that we were still hanging out with each other.
And I just want to take a minute. Like, I hope you hear what's wrong with that. Yeah. A church is directing. This is another cult tactic. The church felt like it had the authority
to tell you that you could not be friends with your best friend.
Who and who you could not be friends with, where and what you could do. Like, that's not okay.
But the wild thing, our husbands were encouraged to hang out with each other.
Yeah.
Just us, you damn women, these wives. we get to that point where we're not allowed to be together. So then we get to sit on, because we were expected to still come to service. So we had to sit on Thursday nights. We couldn't sit next to each other. Eventually we got to the point where we're just like, screw this. Like, this is stupid. And we went and now that I think about it, that's what stopped it. Mm-hmm. That's what stopped it. We sat there for weeks. She sat in the back of the sanctuary and I sat towards the front next to Justin. Mm-hmm. And we got to listen to sermon after sermon after sermon about when women are controlling and when women can't close their mouths. And we got to hear all these examples in scripture of terrible women who felt like they had to control everything. And we went through weeks of that. And then finally we reached the point where we're like, this is stupid. And I think it was like 1 or 2 Thursdays, we decided, no, just come sit next to me. Because she's like, I'm sitting home by myself.
Yeah.
Because again, there's like 5 people there.
Right.
And so I'm like, just come sit up here. You're sitting in the sanctuary. This is stupid.
Yeah.
This is stupid.
Yeah.
And then he stopped pulpit shaming us.
Yeah.
And I think we didn't intend it to be an act of defiance of we did not set out of like, we are going to sit next to each other to prove a point to him.
Right.
No, we were like, this is stupid that you're sitting in the back of a room with 400 chairs in it. You're sitting back there by yourself.
Right.
To put as much distance between us as possible.
Right.
Like, that is stupid.
Yeah, it is stupid. And but just the fact of like the level of manipulation and the level of indoctrination and the level of how much these high control tactics work on people, mm-hmm. is that you were willing to sit on opposite sides of the room from your friend just to please this one person,
and then sit and listen to a sermon about how terrible you and your friend
are, and knowing specifically that it's about you.
Oh yeah, because when he would say certain verses,
yeah,
he would look me in the eye when he said them,
yeah,
from stage.
And the other thing that I find, like, over the last couple of years that has really like cleared the air for me on a lot of this is there's people that were shamed when they weren't even there, and it's the people who leave the church, mm-hmm. and the narrative is told, and the narrative is always, they were the problem. They had a problem.
Poor Tom.
They're against Tom. And, we have to tell that story. So then I don't go chasing after them, because they are now like the plague. Like, this is how these stories are told. Oh. Like, I think about a family that I was convinced they have fallen off the Jesus wagon. They're heathens. I don't even know. Like, it was just something that it was mm-hmm. like, oh, they're bad people, right? Like, you can't talk to them. Don't go near them. And then find out later on, the whole story is a bunch of garbage because it's a church narrative. It's not what really happened.
Well,
and these poor people that I thought these bad things about.
And Tom would always frame it as like, people get mad at me and people walk away and blah, blah, blah. And then he would always end it with, but if they walked back in the doors, we would welcome them because we love them.
Right. And he always related it to, like, not everybody likes Jesus, mm-hmm.
But Jesus will
Paul,
welcome them with open arms.
And you'll be persecuted. There was mm-hmm. always a talk about being persecuted Jesus when you stand up for Jesus. And so these people left the church. They were persecuting Tom like Jesus was persecuted. He was always relating himself back to like Paul or Jesus. And that's another cult tactic. Mm-hmm. Like all of this, like this whole narrative right here is like, I could just start going down the list. Da-ding, 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 da-ding. And so working within the region, at a very busy restaurant, I had known a lady. I had become friends with her through a working relationship outside of the restaurant, like somewhere else. But her and her husband, I'd never met her husband before, and they came into dinner one night, and I stopped and I talked to them. And he put 2 and 2 together of who I was and who I was related to, and his whole demeanor changed. And he was like, oh,
Oh, that your last name matched Froggy's last name.
his dad's, Tom's last, yes. So that I was somehow, oh, are you connected to this family? Yes, this is how I'm connected. And whole demeanor changed. Wife explains to me that he had had an interaction and a falling out with Tom. And then enough details were shared. They were very, very courteous in not oversharing and not trying to.
They weren't degrading.
No, they weren't doing that. He was just like, because of course I'm obviously curious, and then I'm like, oh, wow. And he just said,
can't just be like, ooh, spill the tea.
No, right? And it wasn't like that at that time, right? I was just like, oh no, like, I mean, it just was the type of conversation where he had said a couple of things. I walked away from that conversation and I knew exactly the sermon that I had heard that man's story in.
That's crazy.
There you go. Yeah. He told me the top 3 key things of his story, and it matched the 3 things in that sermon. And I was like, oh, I know who you are. Like, I know who you are.
Oh, that makes sense.
That makes so much sense now.
So when we were still at the high school, there was an instance where there was a man. He didn't attend church very often. His wife and his kids came to church all the time. He did not come to church often. He was kind of like a computer programmer, and he was just kind of like, he was always kind of just like an odd guy, He didn't do Bible studies, he would show up every so often, but like you could tell he was very socially awkward and things. And it came out and it was revealed. He actually went to prison for child pornography. And his wife, obviously, when this came to light, she had no idea. She divorced him. It was a whole thing, right? And she ended up leaving the church because, to go through something like that is humiliating enough and devastating enough, but then to have to come and sit on Sunday mornings, because then after that, and after it came to, the dude's name was in the newspaper, there was a picture of him, you couldn't miss the fact that, oh my gosh, we go to church with this family, and she was just devastated. But then to have to come to church, the place where you're going through this insanely difficult, I could not even imagine having to deal with the mentalness of all of that.
Right.
And then you're coming, and every example he would use, because every sermon we have to talk about sin.
Right.
Every sermon he had to point out sexual sin, pornography, all of these things. Could you imagine that poor woman?
Right.
And then people wondered why she left the church.
Right.
People wondered.
Yeah.
She ended up moving out of the community because, it's so much deeper, because, you can't tell me her neighbors didn't treat her differently. But just to think that you're going through all of that and the world is looking at you, and now your church is doing the same thing, and your pastor is the one perpetuating that?
Yeah.
That's disgusting.
I feel like this has got to be a toxic trait of like a specific type of person, that or pastor, just because I've never experienced, I really honestly, the more we talk about this, I really have not experienced this.
And I'm sure that there's people in other churches that are like, oh yeah, this happens all the time.
I'm sure it happens in a lot of churches.
It became a joke between me and Brandy.
Yeah.
Because we realized we didn't have a word for it until that guy
yep.
But we had known for years.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That, Tom's worked up about something. This person was in the office and Tom yelled at him, and now this is an example, or this is a verse he's using.
Yeah, because other than Tom and listening to Mars Hill, and Mark Driscoll, I really can't say that I've had any experience with any other narcissistic pastor. Yeah. So I'm thinking that this is a toxic trait of a narcissist.
Yeah. But I mean, it was wide known.
Yeah.
Everyone knew
everybody knows
that this,
and everybody's okay with it.
To the
weirdly
point,
enough.
I alluded, I believe it was in like our prologue episode. I said like I've been deposed. And I will tell that story when we get to that point in the timeline. But when I was deposed for that case that was specifically against this church and against Tom, the lawyer who deposed me, who was not Tom or the church's lawyer.
No, the other person.
They asked me, has Tom ever said anything negative about people or a situation publicly, whether it was in a sermon or in a meeting? And I was like,
yeah.
I'm going to tell you right now, go watch their YouTube. Before that, there's boxes in a closet in the office of the church that we were not allowed to throw away. There's cassette tapes. Then after the cassette tape went out, then we had CDs.
That was one of my first jobs at the church.
Oh, it was burning all the CDs. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
And
Sorry.
so every single sermon Tom ever preached, there's a recording of it.
Yeah.
And so I said, if you, I don't know,
you got the time.
You got paralegals, you got interns, whatever you got. Like, if you got the time, you give me a situation where it's like Tom says, da 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 da. Oh, that's
so and so.
So and so.
That's so and so.
It became such a joke that, you know, like the TV show Friends, how they name their episodes, like the one where Ross finds out, or the one where Rachel has a baby, or, you know. Brandy and I started calling the sermons the one where so-and-so was in trouble. Oh, the one where Froggy did drugs again. Oh, the one where Brandy and Amanda got in trouble. Like, it became a joke between us because I'm not joking you. It was such a problem for him to feel like he had to address things from the stage in a narcissistic, passive-aggressive way that you would be hard-pressed to find a sermon where he wasn't making a point towards
and
someone. Even
to the point of, like, if it wasn't somebody specific that day, like the marriage narrative. Like something that I noticed.
Oh no, because if some husband came in and complained about his wife or vice versa, we then had to hear about marriage for 3 weeks.
But the narrative, the part of the narrative that was disturbing was always that it was always like a husband and a wife, and it was never like if your husband's abusive, right? It was never like this is what the husband should do to not be abusive. It was always geared towards wife. This is how you need to change so that your husband's not abusive. Yeah. Like that was always the way the narrative would go.
Your husband is abusive. We're sorry about that. Have you tried praying?
Yeah.
Have you tried maybe smiling more and not talking back? Perhaps cook him his favorite dinner. That might help. Then he'll stop hitting you. Like...
I'm either gonna laugh or cry at that comment. But that's what and that's pulpit shaming. I'm sorry, but
then we would wrap it up in a nice bow at the end of that and say, but we want you to be safe. So if you need to be safe, you let us know.
But never deal.
Yeah.
And this is a whole nother episode, but you say that, and then when the wife comes to you, because we're going to follow Matthew 18, and, you know, like, I've addressed this with my husband and said this was a problem, so now I have to take it to somebody else. And that person has come into my home and we've talked. And my husband is not repentant, so now we've gone to the church level.
Yes.
And when the church then just, like, protects him, it disappears and nothing happens, and then you're told as the wife that you're the problem and go back, and... you're just going to have to, God will release you from it when he wants to, or pray about all those things you said, like,
because
awful.
But what it comes down to is this is the system we're talking about.
Yeah.
We've created a system within these churches where there's really no rules. Everyone can make up stuff as they go. So where is the accountability for these pastors? Really, when it comes down to it, it doesn't lie anywhere.
Right.
Because it takes multiple people over multiple years saying things multiple times over and over again to bring things to light to hold anyone accountable. And so what we're doing in this podcast, we're trying to address the system. Tom has been held accountable, but I guarantee you there were people back in the 90s who were saying stuff against Tom. There was people in the early 2000s that were saying stuff against Tom, and there's people that are sitting in that church today that are still saying things against Tom. And it's coming to light. He's being held accountable. My whole point with this is it is a specific type of leader. It is a leader who thinks they have everything figured out. Their way is the only way. Their way is the right way. They are the one who God chose to lead this church. They are the one who is responsible for shepherding all these people, which I would argue, if you are going to pulpit shame people, you are not actually a shepherd. You are a man standing on a stage with a title. And so they feel like they are the only ones who are going to hold all these people accountable, and they're the only voice that matters. That's narcissism.
Yeah.
And there's a book, it's called When Narcissism Comes to Church by Chuck DeGroat. It is a great book because he points out how in the evangelical movement, we're basically like attracting these narcissistic pastors because we have been indoctrinated with the belief that your pastor is the end all be all. What their voice says, like that is the only one that matters. We've created this us versus
it's like this
them
celebrity pastorness, you know.
Yeah, but then on top of it, we have us versus them. We've created this distinction between somehow these non-denominational evangelical churches are better than any other type of Christian.
Everybody else doesn't have it. We got it. Yeah.
And
we're doing it right. They're doing it wrong.
And you have someone with some charismaticness to them.
Yeah, personality. That's. I mean, there's.
And you have the ones that have the. That's where we're getting the mega churches,
right?
Because you have someone who's charismatic, right, and they can put on a show, and they can wear the mask, and they can go out and they can do the work, and they can be the face of the organization.
Well, and it's a double-edged sword because you really do need a lot of those personality traits are required to do the thing that you're being called to do.
Yeah.
And then, but on the other hand, these same characteristics, the same traits are also very toxic in another regard.
Yeah. But we wanted to bring this up now because as we move through this story, we will talk about pulpit shaming. We will bring up specific instances of pulpit shaming, and you can see just what a widespread problem this was. And so, to combat pulpit shaming, to be able to move forward from this, is say something.
Yeah.
Say something. And be that person who's willing to put a name to it and say, this is not okay.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't until I was able to recognize what it was. I knew what was happening.
Right.
But to know that there's a term for it.
Right.
And so to say, that is not okay.
Right. And then to realize, like, how long it went on without realizing that it was necessarily wrong.
Yeah, and to think that it was normal.
Like something, you have some... I'm not gonna say I was completely oblivious that it wasn't, like, I didn't like it. It gave me an icky feeling.
Yeah.
But it's not like I didn't know what it was to know that it was a problem.
So there was a red
that's
flag.
That's not how you do it.
Yeah, there's a red flag, and so you just dismiss it.
Yeah.
You say, oh, well, I must be reading too much into it, and whatever you tell yourself.
Yeah.
But no, a red flag is a red flag.
Yeah, absolutely. Burning Butterflies is a listener-supported podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our amazing supporters on Patreon.
Follow the link in our show notes to learn how you can become a Patreon supporter too. Supporters get exclusive access to bonus content each month, including outtakes, cut content, and supporter-only episodes. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating on your listening platform.
Burning Butterflies is a production of Asha Media. Thank you for listening.